so Mr. Paulson, you mentioned about economic eye curtain speech really drive the message home some time ago. So climate change is the area of U.S.-China cooperation that holds really potential. And both Secretary John Kerry and Minister Xie Zhenhua, the two climate envoys by both President Xi and President Biden, has spoke each other at Davos and COP26 and actually reached agreement. John Kerry actually even attended our meeting at the Security Conference about 2 years ago at the CCG. So what do you think? I mean, how the U.S. and China relation go forward? I mean, what are the possible paths for cooperation for the two countries amongst competition? But then there's a climate change, there's a finance crisis, a recession, high inflation, people to people exchange, global development. So what's your overall assessment, for the Sino-U.S. cooperation, and what are the challenges we have to face?
Okay, Dr. Wang, I think I got most of that. So let me begin by saying, I think there's no doubt that our two countries are strategic competitors. And I think we're competitors across really all of the domains, technology, finance, economy, military, and ideology. But despite that, our two countries have common goals. We have some shared interests. We need to have peace, stability, world order, a stable climate, right? And so we have shared goals. And so the question is, how can we cooperate at the same time we compete? And I think there's a number of areas that are important. Citizen exchanges are very important. I mean, the work that Wang Shi and I have done over the years, what I found, even though I have a very different culture and political system, the Chinese and American people like each other. We have a natural affinity for each other. And I think some of it has been hampered by COVID, right? I haven't been able to travel to China since 2019. Many business people that were in China have come back as a result of COVID. So I think that's important. Climate change obviously is another area, and that is an area that our two presidents have designated as an area where we should work together. We've got groups working together on methane and on other things as climate. I think this is made more difficult by the competitive relationship and what I consider to be a fraud. But as I think about the areas where we should be working together, and I think it's important to both countries that we do this and to the whole world, because we are the biggest climate emitters, right? China is by far the biggest emitter of carbon emissions, and the U.S. has only 4% of the world's population, but 11 to 12% of carbon emissions, right? And so both countries have got a real need to work together. And so here's what I think we should be doing. First, we both should be doing more research and developing the breakthrough technologies we're going to need to avoid climate disaster, and some of the harder technologies we need to do. So that is clearly an area we should work together. I think we both should work on lifting and eliminating tariffs on environmental goods or services. It makes no sense to charge tariffs on environmental goods and services, right? Doesn't make economic sense, doesn't make political sense to pay more for the environmental goods and services we need. We can cooperate more. We each need to provide incentives to channel private sector money into developing and rolling out in scale the technologies that we need to reduce carbon emissions. I think we both can do more to share technologies and make sure that we deploy the key technologies in each of our countries. This may require some concession on both of our governments' part, but I think that's very important. I think so. We need to develop clean technologies, and I think we need to really work to accelerate the reduction of carbon emissions in emerging nations. Each of us can do that, right? Just looking at the brick and roads countries, they're responsible for 28% of carbon emissions today, but by 2050, it could be 60% if we don't do something, so we can work there. And lastly, I'm going to come back to the point that you mentioned that Larry Summers said, which is, when we look at carbon governance, global carbon governance, because, to me, it was inspiring, really inspiring to hear what Wang Huiyao was doing and everything China was doing and Wang Huiyao done in Glasgow. That's very, very necessary, but it's not sufficient, right? So right now, we are, even if we met the Glasgow targets, the globe would overheat, and we're not even close to being on a path to meet those targets, right? And so I think we need a different approach to climate governance. And we're not going to get anywhere unless we see the US, China, India, the other big countries doing more at the governmental level to incentivize industry. So there's a lot we can do. One area where we can work on together is, on the Belt and Road, for instance, and the Paulson Institute, my institute, is working with the Green Principles. We were the first U.S. NGO to join into that effort, work with to set green development principles for the Belt and Road. I think in working with multilateral development banks, the Paulson Institute is working with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which are doing some very interesting things there. But I think all multilateral development banks and the Bretton Woods institutions need to do more. And we're not going to do more unless the governments come together to give them the capacity and the financial support they need. And so this is an area where U.S. and China and the other major countries of the world need to cooperate and work together. So there's a lot to be done. I've got to be honest in saying there's not nearly as much being done as should be being done. And that has to do with, the strategic competition and the nature of the fraught relationship between our two countries. But I come back again to say, there's nothing wrong with admitting we're strategic competitors and we're competing in all these areas. But we also need to acknowledge both countries have shared goals. We need peace. We need prosperity. We need a global order that works. And we need to save our planet, because climate change is a threat not only to economic security, but global stability and life on Earth as we know it. So I believe that we have a saying in the U.S. that necessity is the mother of invention, right? And I happen to believe that necessity is going to bring our countries together. And again, I look forward to the day when we can travel freely and I can visit China and we can have more interpersonal relations. Because the reason I set up, part of the reasons I set up the Paulson Institute is I knew there were going to be tough times between our governments, Beijing and Washington, D.C. Now, I didn't predict it was going to be as tough as it is now, but there are going to be tough times. And I think we need other linkages, people-to-people linkages, economic linkages, NGOs working together, people working together to solve. And that's why I think the work that Wang Huiyao did, bringing the big delegation from China to Glasgow to interact with all the other leaders around the world, is so essential. So I say thank you to Wang Huiyao.
Great. Thank you, Hank. You're absolutely right. I think we need the multiple linkages and exchanges and dialogues like this, and particularly face-to-face dialogue that we hope that you can come as soon as we lifted all those quarantines. And so you mentioned about this critical component of cooperation between China and U.S. I mean, you particularly, I highly supported your idea, on a tariff for those environmental sustainable development products, we should really give them, lift the tariff sanctions. Particularly now we're facing such a high inflation. I mean, also the food crisis, energy crisis, Ukraine-Russian conflict.
That's a different issue. And I think the US government is looking at reducing those tariffs. I've said from the beginning that those tariffs don't make economic sense, not good for either country, and is a tax on US consumers, and it is not good for trade. But I was making a different point. I was making a point that there have been long-standing tariffs on environmental goods and services, and there I think China needs to do more. Because when we've tried to get people together and at the WTA and do things with the WTO and elsewhere to lift environmental goods and tariffs on environmental goods and services, there China has been resistant to eliminating those tariffs. So I think there's more we can do in these areas. And I know they're politically complicated, and I know that the competition and economic competition makes it more complicated, but I think that the fight to save our planet is more important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to do both on both sides. I mean, leave tariff on, China, U.S. should do all the same. I mean, that's great. I think the statement that we made here. But also you mentioned about this green Belt and Road. I mean, that's very interesting. You have helping setting the green standard on that. And also Biden has proposed B3W, there's a BRI, there's EU global gateway. I mean, infrastructure, green infrastructure are probably the need for the future, and we should probably all work together on that. Find something together to work on.
That's extremely important, because the world needs hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe trillions of dollars in infrastructure. But how that, and no NGO likes to see infrastructure. They've never seen a dam they like, they never see a road they like, never seen a railroad they like, never seen an oil well, but they all can be done in ways while there's less damage on the environment. And that's another area the Paulson Institute is looked to work with organizations. And I think every development bank, including the China Development Bank, the Exim Bank, all the development banks can do a better job of planning in advance, right? Rather than writing impact statements after the project has already been done to harm the environment, to plan and to figure out how to build the infrastructure so as to do as little damage as possible to the environment. And we haven't talked much about the biodiversity crisis, but I see the biodiversity crisis as being every bit as alarming as the climate crisis, because two of them go together. But the climate crisis is accelerating the destruction of biodiversity and vice versa. And we're seeing species extinction on Earth at 1,000 times the natural rate. So at this rate, 50% of all species on Earth would be extinct by 2050. And so in many ways, this is even more alarming than climate change, because with climate change, we understand the science behind it, right? And we understand what we need to know. But in terms of disrupting Mother Nature, we don't even know what we don't know. And so I think it's alarming. And so the key thing we need to do is protect the environment and not destroy it. And we can do some simple things that the financial institutions do, and in terms of our ag subsidiaries and fishing and timbering, subsidies in those areas. So there's a lot we can do. China has done a lot in China, an awful lot with a cleaner China. I think there's a potential for China to do more outside of China, looking at the biodiversity, but there's a potential for all of us to do more. And so this is, again, another area that where there's a global crisis, which I hope brings people together. And I think COVID has led people to focus more on Mother Nature, right? And so I think that may be an incentive. But again, this is an area where Wang Huiyao has been a real leader. And the work that he and his foundation have done in terms of restoring mangroves, for instance, which are vital to the ecosystem, protecting coastlines and nurseries for fishes and so on. And so he also been a leader in this area in China, and we've been pleased and honored to work with him within China on biodiversity conservation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Hank, for excellent remarks. Absolutely. I mean, the cooperation between China and U.S. on all those development banks, infrastructure, and biodiversity, absolutely crucial. So thank you again for that. And actually, my staff was telling me we're almost closing, but we actually had multiple channels online, almost 500,000 viewers that tuned into our dialogue. So to conclude, I would like to have both Wang Shi and Hank for your closing remarks. How can we, particularly from business community, NGO sectors, can we work together between China and the U.S. on those common challenges facing the world, and how can we work better in China and the U.S. in terms of those common challenges facing humankind, climate change and the biodiversity, and of course, all those future the catastrophe, economic, recession. So perhaps Wang Shi can conclude that, and I'll have Secretary Paulson to conclude after you. Wang Shi, 你能听见吗？
好，
Thank you. Yeah, listening to the presentation made by Mr. Henry Paulson, I felt the same thing regarding how to better facilitate the cooperation and collaboration between U.S. and China in the future for the common challenges faced by human beings. As a leader of NGO and a leader in a business community in China, I think after China joined WTO, China has been regarded as a market which was open. And at the same time, China is also a very important bridge between the different streams of the flow of the commodities and the services. So as a businessman, from the business environment, it's fair to say that from the beginning of reform and opening up all the way to now, across the whole systems of the finance, the commodities development and the trade and everything, we have seen the interrelated world between you and me, between different countries and different stakeholders. Well, actually, after 50 years of journey of this visit, be it in US or Europe, the MNCs or the companies or SMEs having relations with China's enterprises, especially the SMEs, is very important because MNCs, so you don't have to talk too much about it. They have their organizations operation in China already. But for SMEs of other countries, their relation with China's businesses is really valuable, especially against the background of COVID, against the background of the current challenges. In the supply chain, especially, we have seen the blocking and the disruptions during these years. So it's a really hard, very hard time. And like the business of China, for them, it's very hard to get out. And for those business in other countries, very hard to them to get in China. So from the emotional perspective, or from the business perspective, it's really hard times. The connection is very important. And we have felt a lot of disruptions in the connections between each other. So the conflict does not come from the trade barriers or the tariffs or the trade conflicts, not that. It's the COVID, it's the pandemic. We have had the same expectation that after COVID is over, we can be connected and reconnected together. So everyone is actually prepared for that moment to come, couldn't wait for that moment to come. So after so many years of the connections, other countries, especially those tourist countries, that they have got used to numerous Chinese visitors and tourists coming to their territories to visit, and they earn money also in the end. And so right now, there's a lot of disruptions and a blockage of the travel, the ban in travel, which lead to the disruptions of their income in these tourist countries as well. So a lot of countries, they really in the great need of China's investment. The international investment and international assistance in some less developed countries is also very important. So we need to reopen. And in terms of, for example, the clean energies development, like the wind power development, batteries, and the energy storage, and we have found that this country is in need of China's investment, collaboration, and China's companies to come and to reside over there, to cooperate with them. So the climate is becoming warmer. This is one issue. Cooperation is very necessary and is a must. And this must actually is beyond the need for conflicts. We have to join hands, and we have to set aside the conflicts of the interest. Like Paulson has said that the biodiversity conservation is equally important as climate change issues. I agree with them, and we have to keep humble as human beings in front of the nature, in front of the biological environment, because we are yet to know the full picture of the influence or impact of the climate change to biodiversity. And we have to wait and see, and we have to take initiative in preserve the nature in advance, no matter what happened in the end. And also, we have to explore the common way to, or the common solutions to protect the biodiversity, which can benefit all of us, especially after COVID. So the biggest imperative of humanity, I feel, is the initiative taken by China, US, and EU countries for common development and common prosperity. But I think the three parties are the most important. US, China, and EU. These are the three most important force for NGOs. So cooperation is also the core issue for them, and above which we have to set aside the impact from the COVID, and we have to reconnect with each other. Thank you.
Mr. Wang, you mentioned it very well. I think that's very important to have these exchanges between the business, between the people, and travel. Outbound tourists from China, all those good things that I think are really needed to really keep the bridges and the flow. So Secretary Paulson, your last word, and how U.S.-China business and to government and also with other countries to work together for facing the common challenges.
Yeah, so I won't repeat a lot of the things I said earlier. I'll begin with the governments, and I really do think that I'm say much about governments because I think, unfortunately, our governments are communicating. It's good that they're communicating. There's communication at a senior level, but there's a lot of communication that isn't taking place. And so I think at the government level, I just recommend that they do things together that are simpler and easier to learn, so we can build on success. And those are the communication, perhaps the strategic and military area to avoid conflict. Very important. Communication from the macroeconomic policies. There's one thing that this recent period has pointed out is this great irony. Just at the time that there's more trouble between our two countries, more competition, more fraught relationship, it's clear how interdependent we are. If there are issues in China, economic problems or COVID lockdowns, it impacts what happens in the US economy. If there's something in the US economy, it impacts China. If we have another global financial crisis, where it'll start, it will impact both countries. So we sure need communications about macroeconomic policy at a senior level. And then I think climate change, I outlined all the things that should be done. We know those things aren't going to be done right now. They're just not. So realistically, we have to do some simple things. The working group, that's been set up with John Kerry and his counterpart, working on methane or whatever the issues are. And so to get some simpler things done. And then I come back to the private sector, because I can be very negative, even if I get outside of Goldman Sachs, or excuse me, if I get outside of what's going on between the United States and China and all the conflict and fraught relationship. Just looking at globally, we're not doing the things we need to do to meet the climate crisis. But the good news is what you see in the private sector, because what we've seen is due to a lot of innovation there. We've seen the cost of renewables come down so they're competitive, right? So in half the world economies, if you have scalable wind or solar, it's competitive with, and in many cases better than coal or gas. And so we've seen that, number one. And that's a big positive. And then what we're seeing financial institutions are putting pressure on companies to take action. Their investors are, and their customers are. The people are, the American people, the Chinese people around the world want to see progress. And so businesses are innovating at a faster rate than I've ever seen. And I've probably talked in the last year with the CEOs of 80 global companies from all over the world. And if I talked with those companies 2 or 3 years ago, they'd say, oh yeah, we're the best at environment and climate change. Talk to my sustainability officer. I want to talk to you about US-China relations or what's going on with the economy. Today, they're all focused on climate change. And so they're making progress. And so I think there. And so I think there will be opportunities for cross investment in this area and for companies to continue to make progress. And so that's where it is. But right now, I think that there's going to be a limit to what we can do and to make a lot of progress as long as the Russian, Ukraine, Russia is continuing to invade Ukraine. So I think that's going to be, that's doing a lot to disrupt the global economy. But overall, there's plenty of things we can do. And it's very good and applicable that you had Wang Huiyao on this discussion. I think a lot of what is going to be done by the private sector. So thank you for this opportunity. And it's always good, we can see some of the problems we've had even with technology today. But I look forward to the day when I can travel to China and see all my friends again and have face-to-face communications. And with my colleagues at the Paulson Institute, I had a Zoom call with them again this Monday and thank them for all the work our Chinese colleagues are doing in China, in Beijing and Shanghai. But I haven't seen them in person now in a couple of years.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Paulson. Excellently, you said at your closing remark. I think absolutely the government is important. They should increase the level of communication and dialogue. Absolutely so crucial. And you emphasize the business. I mean, business is crucial. I mean, absolutely important with all the multinationals, private sectors, SME, and all the NGOs. So that's great message both of you have outlined today. I really appreciate all the great contribution you made. So that's all the time we have. We're going to conclude our special dialogue series at 8th the China Globalization Forum. We're having another 20 ambassadors roundtable next. So we have to stop here. I appreciate all your contributions. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.